welcome to you all to the NHS Providers Virtual Governance and Quality Conference for 2021. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ron Kerr, the Chair of NHS Providers, and I'm delighted to be your conference chair for the next few days. Over the next 4 days, we will be discussing and debating the key challenges and opportunities that you are facing. This year, we've combined our usual separate governance and quality conference into one event, which asks how we can best meet the challenges of ensuring quality care in an environment of ever increasing complexity against a backdrop of the unprecedented challenge that you're all facing. Over the course of the next few days, we will explore how fresh thinking helped in what was an incredible system-wide response over the last 18 months and look at lessons learned which continue to help as system integration moves further forward. Demand and capacity continues to challenge, and as staff increasingly rely on compassionate leadership and the right culture to cope amid the dilemmas of the day-to-day. Can I please welcome to stage and screen NHS Providers Deputy Chief Executive, Saffron Cordery. Over to you, Saffron.
Thank you very much, Ron. And if we can move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so firstly, want to say what a pleasure it is to be opening this conference at a time when the issues of governance and quality couldn't be more important with the changes that are afoot, and also given what we have been through as an NHS and as a country, and indeed are still going through. So I think, you know, it's a great time to be having this conference. And as Ron said, there is so much to discuss. What I'm going to look at this morning is just to range across a few areas, taking in the themes of the conference in terms of complexity, risk and relationship. And I'm going to look at where we are now, what the white paper is telling us, what we need to really think about, and then focus a bit on where next. And I'm really looking forward to questions and answers later, so we can have a bit of a discussion about some of this. So let me kick off with where we are now. And I call this slide the steady-ish evolution of collaboration and integration. So this is a real focus on the journey that we have taken in the NHS, but with partners, to really think about collaboration and integration in the planning and delivery of services. And I think it really does inform our perspectives as NHS providers on the issues of quality and the importance of good governance for boards, because I think when you look backwards, you learn a lot about how you should shape your responses going forward. So this timeline, or this journey, if you want, is not exhaustive, but it does establish the phases of integration and collaboration. It's one perspective. Obviously, many people would have different perspectives on this, but it's just something that we've put together to try and really explain how this is evolving. So what this looks at is not just the time that has passed since we really embarked on integration and collaboration, but also looks at the underpinning aims of that integration and how they've changed over time. And I think for me, that's one of the most important factors here, because if we cast our mind back to before the 2012 Act, we were already well along the path of integration between both within the NHS and also between health and social care. We had integration pilots running across the country, and we also had the Total Place initiative. But I think one of the interesting elements there was, what was the underpinning emphasis there for those initiatives? And I think what we were really seeing there was a focus on value for money. How do we get the most out of the public pound, as it were? And there was a real sense of, you know, if you looked up in the Northwest in Leeds, there was the sense of the Leeds pound, and a lot of work done across that area about thinking about how best to spend public service funding to achieve the best possible outcome. So I would say that in terms of this timeline, it kicked off really with that concept of value for money. We then had what was a bit of an inflection point really with the 2012 Act, which, whilst we were on a journey of integration and collaboration in one part of the forest, we then had quite a change to focus really on the role of individual institutions and what many people said was a restructuring of the NHS that you could see from outer space. I think it will be interesting to compare that restructuring with what we are now going through and decide whether you could see it from outer space or not. And I think the jury might be out on how far reaching the changes are now as well. But the 2012 Act was a real inflection point because it focused minds on institutional roles and responsibilities, and a focus on autonomy, a focus on the role of what individual organisations could achieve. It didn't mean that cooperation couldn't happen, and there was a lot of cooperation that took place. But I think that the driving force behind that was this sense of individual institutional autonomy, working in strategic partnerships where there was integration to take things forward. However, it's really interesting that, in a sense, the 2012 Act didn't quite have chance to be fully implemented in the spirit that was underpinning it before we actually had quite a change in the leadership across the NHS. And whilst the structural changes of the 2012 Act did take place, what we were seeing was an immediate focus then on integration and collaboration. We had Simon Stevens coming into what was the NHS Commissioning Board and then was renamed NHS England. And we quite quickly had then the 5-year forward view. And this was a real sense of an understanding that the increase in demand across the NHS really needed to be tackled. There were very big patient flow issues, and the 5-year forward view really focused then on how do we manage that demand and flow. And that was the underpinning impetus for that piece of integration and collaboration. Fast forward a few years, and there was a huge injection of funding to the NHS in 2018 with the 70th anniversary of the NHS's creation, and a big birthday present with £20.5 billion. But of course, that had to come with a delivery plan in order to demonstrate how well that money would be used. And that's what we saw with then the changing from the 5-year forward view into the long-term plan. And that was, again, another shift into a greater focus on prevention, population health, and that drive for integration with social care. And that's not to say that those drivers weren't there already, but it was what was privileged within each of these different phases. And shortly after the long-term plan was published, we then had a set of legislative proposals pulled together by NHS England and Improvement, unusually, rather than the Department of Health, in partnership with a range of stakeholders across the NHS, which sought to put the long-term plan on a firmer footing legislatively in order to overcome some of the challenges and barriers that were there. So that was the plan for then. A real focus on tackling population health and prevention, working with social care. But then we had another inflection point, which was the general election. And I think things changed again. And they changed because the government had quite a substantial majority. So I think instead of thinking, how do we get a set of moderate proposals through Parliament, there was a real sense of we could probably go bigger with this, and from government's perspective, and think about more wide-ranging changes. And then, of course, we had last year, we had 2020, and we had the pandemic. And I think that, we all know the impact of the pandemic on the NHS. We all know the instant furthering of integration and collaboration that took place then. And I think what we also know is what the pandemic told us about health inequalities. both in terms of the risk that our staff from Black and ethnic minority groups faced, but also the Black Lives Matters movement and the real continued raising of that consciousness and awareness of the differential impact on ethnic minority colleagues. And so there were two things that came together there. And I think this sense of integration and collaboration was built upon to focus not only on the response to the pandemic and recovery and use integration and collaboration as a means of charting the way through that, but also a renewed focus on health inequalities. And so earlier this year, we had the white paper consultation, and we are expecting the legislative proposals to come forward probably in June. It was announced in the Queen's speech, and we're expecting them probably June, if not July. But I think that gives a sense of how the underpinning drive for integration and collaboration has evolved over time, and it doesn't always have the same basis. So if you start with value for money at one end and go right the way through to responding and recovering from a pandemic and focusing on health inequalities, things have changed. That doesn't mean that value for money isn't as important as it ever was. It's become one of many drivers. And I think the other thing, you'll see a kind of the set of hexagons in the top left-hand corner there. I think it's really worth remembering that nothing exists in a vacuum, and the move to integration and collaboration isn't only something that's been pursued in this country across the NHS. We have seen it across other parts of the world. So I've picked out a few there. So we've got, Europe. We've seen examples from Spain in terms of Ribera Salud. I think it's probably the most famous of those approaches, with population full service model. And we've got the in Germany, we've got the Gesundes Kinderspital, which is about integrated care. In the USA, we've got all sorts of approaches: Kaiser Permanente, Geisinger, the US Veterans Healthcare Association with networks of care. So all sorts of examples there. And then I think, interestingly as well, across the wider world, in terms of New Zealand, Israel, Japan, taking these very health and well-being focused approaches, which are looking at population health, and in Japan in particular, integration with social care, admission avoidance, health and well-being, which are all influencing academic thinking on healthcare services and how they should be run. And of course, influencing thinking in terms of the NHS and how that should happen. I think one point I would make on this, however, is that all of the models that we see from across the world are predicated on healthcare services, which are, of course, not taxation funded in the way that the NHS is, and also are looking at units of delivery of a considerably smaller scale. So I think there are some interesting elements there. So that's my sweep in terms of the evolution, really, of integration and collaboration over the past 10, 12 years or so. Of course, you could go further back, but we don't have time for that. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. I'm going to think now a bit about what in that context, what the white paper is actually telling us. What's it saying? What does it want to do? And we've got three main chunks. But before I go into that, I think that it's worth saying that the white paper does follow an overall direction of travel, and it's a really important mix of measures which start to make sense of integration and ease the current hurdles and challenges that some are facing in order to put this integration into place. I think the other important element, and I can't understate this, is a real shift in the balance between central and local control, which I think will alter the overall environment in which we're all operating, whether you're in a central organisation like NHS England Improvement, whether you're in a regional body, whether you're in an ICS or a provider organisation, or working in primary care or local government. I think this shift, a rebalancing of where power sits, I think will be very interesting and important as we see it play out. So what we've got here are a set of proposals under the heading Working Together to Integrate Care, and that's the establishment of the ICS NHS body, which is really the one which will oversee the delivery of care across systems, focusing on day-to-day operational issues, financial allocations in terms of capital and revenue, and look at population planning of care. And then we've got the Health and Care Partnership body, which is really about supporting that integration, promoting partnerships, planning for system health and population health, working with social care, looking at the role of place. So we've got these two different bodies sitting side by side. How they will look in practice is still being developed at the moment, and I think we need to see what that looks like. But at the moment, that is the two organisations are sitting side by side, and it will, I think, on publication of the legislation, I think from a provider perspective, this will be one of the most interesting elements. Alongside the bodies that are there, we've also got this strand, which is enhancing public confidence and accountability. This is the bit that does set out quite a clear set of powers of direction for the Secretary of State, potentially reverses the underpinning intention of the 2012 Act, which was separating operational and political running of the NHS. Critically, it includes the ability of the Secretary of State to intervene in reconfiguration decisions locally, will have more control over arm's length bodies, and will also be able to, it's going to propose getting rid of local education and training boards, which, whilst they perhaps haven't had a big role, are an important bit of the local landscape in terms of employer focus on what's needed to deliver services locally. So we've got that ranch of powers there for the Secretary of State. Then we've got some elements which focus on reducing bureaucracy. Critically, the Competitions and Market Authority will no longer be involved in service changes at a local level. There will be a new provider selection regime, which will enable greater flexibility of how services are arranged locally. There will be flexibilities around the tariff, and also the Secretary of State will be able to create new trusts with minimal bureaucracy. So some interesting changes there. And alongside that, we've also got some tweaks around social care. So the Better Care Fund will stand alone rather than being part of the NHS mandate, and the bill is also likely to enable direct payments to social care providers from the Department of Health and Social Care. It will be easier for the Secretary of State to direct NHS England on specific public health functions. And then we've also got some proposals which were left over from the last Queen's speech, which didn't quite make it through, which are the establishment of the Health Services Safety Investigations body, and also the establishment of statutory medical examiner. So there's a really broad sweep of measures here in terms of the white paper, but essentially I would focus our attention really on the change in that balance between central and local, and also the creation of the ICS NHS body and that health and care partnership. This is really bringing local government as well in centre stage in terms of working with the NHS. Could I have the next slide, please? So if we're thinking about this from an NHS provider board perspective, I think it's really important to think about what these changes mean. And if we look at the impact on good governance, I think we know that in governance terms, what is likely to happen is that governance is going to feel a lot more complex than it has. We've got a unitary board at the moment, which is a system that, or a focus on governance, which works effectively across different types of organisation. I think what we're going to see with the proposals in the white paper is a real overlay of complexity, because what we're not seeing is much being removed from the set of rules and regulations that currently exist. So we're seeing new processes and approaches overlaying existing modes of governance. So I think that that's going to be one of the first things that we need to bear in mind. It is going to be complex. One of the themes of this conference is complexity, and I think we are in a very complex landscape now, having come through the pandemic and this real need to recover. I think the white paper overlaying that can help to deliver that recovery, but it will also add some real complexity. And where does that complexity lie? Well, I think in terms of governance, it's complexity in terms of duties and powers. We really need clarity and agreement on what they will be. And critically, and I think I would highlight this, a focus on a clear line of sight. And it's a core element really of accountability and governance is, do the people who are making the decisions have a clear line of sight over what they're doing? And are they able to be answerable for the decisions they take? And I think, the only test you need for that is if it came to judicial review, who would be the one on the stand? And that's the question you need to ask yourself. So in terms of accountability and line of sight, I think that issue around decision makers being answerable is really, really important. Collaboration is really positive and important, but it is going to bring new risk and unforeseen risk. And I think that is created both by new governance arrangements, but also by the context in which we're now operating. And I think that it will be absolutely critical that there is a new approach to risk management for systems, and included in that is a new approach really to thinking about how inspection and oversight works within that context. So how is regulation going to function in this new world, and what's the impact of that on governance? But at the end of the day, trusts and FT boards are responsible for delivering the majority of healthcare in place on their local patch. It may be commissioned by others, but often they will be delivering that either alone or in partnership with either existing or new partners. And it's really important that trusts have the influence that they need to make sure that the right decisions are made. And so in terms of governance, I think that's a really important element. In terms of the impact on delivering high quality care, obviously ICSs need a core focus on quality and safety, and it has to be at the forefront of decision making and planning when they are thinking about delivering that triple aim that has been set out for ICSs, which is better health and well-being, better care for all, and sustainable use of NHS resources. So there are now moves to put in place kind of system responsibilities for quality, ensuring fundamental standards of quality are delivered, focusing on risk, safety, inequalities, tackling variation, and a real need to continually improve. These are all sensible approaches and they need to be there. But I think that fundamentally, in terms of system working, we still need to think hard about where quality sits. So where do the accountabilities lie? I think that trust leaders who working with partners across systems have worked really hard to stay sighted on quality amidst the challenges of the last year, and they'll need to keep that focus going forward. But it's critical that that risks are really managed across those organizational boundaries, and that the relationship between different organizations is managed effectively, so that everyone can understand who is accountable for quality and how they can deliver that. I think there's a sense that the current system may be overly assurance focused in terms of quality. And I think that this is quite tricky, because if you get the balance wrong and focus only on assurance, you change the nature of the existing partnerships that are already out there. People working together quite naturally, problem solving, sensing what's coming up, already got their really effective systems in place. And so what we don't want to do is overlay that with an assurance system, which means that those partnerships are undermined. Critically, we need to make sure that we've got patient voice at the forefront of how we are organising services. So, trust will tell us that the patient voice is critical in terms of understanding what quality is and what it means, but it's not quite clear where that fits yet in terms of the ICS vision. At the moment, the language feels very much done to rather than done with. And I think that the other thing that's really important is that whatever is set up with systems needs to be able to adapt and respond to need, ensure that citizens' voices are heard, that there are opportunities to learn from all of the players in the system, particularly those that represent the patient voice. And then finally, and I think this is of course important, is that lots can be lost with the sheer abundance of change and challenge in the system, and we really mustn't lose sight of that. So if I could have the next slide, please. So we've been on this journey of integration and collaboration over a sustained period. We've now got a set of proposals in place that will overlay a lot of what's already there with new ways of working, new partnerships. We've got to work out how we navigate those, how we manage them. And I think that core here is managing that complexity. So recognizing that complexity is there, being mindful about what it means for effective leadership, but also recognizing that wherever you sit in the system, you are going to be surrounded by a set of new and different, equally valid perspectives and voices, working with partners who are all speaking different languages, essentially, using different terminologies, working in different ways with different accountabilities. And managing that is going to be incredibly complex. And I think that one of the critical elements here is about managing the different conceptualizations that people will have within systems. And that's going to have a real challenge for trust leaders, for trust boards, for those working in partnerships, because if your mindset is different to that of your partners, then there is the possibility that you will miss each other on the way, and that will create not only risk, but it also means that opportunity to build really deep relationships of trust could also be undermined. So really understanding each other, identifying and mitigating the risks is absolutely critical, and building on those relationships that in many places already exist is also critical. I think on the issue of risk, I think that at the moment we're in a situation where we have to remember that risk has to be managed proactively and not retrospectively. And I think that what could happen in the current system working is that it could slow down the pace of change. So the ability to be alert and adaptive to new scenarios, understand those risks and mitigate them could be undermined. At the last governance conference that we held a couple of years ago, one of the things that came to the fore was this concept that doubt is our friend. And I think that doubt can be looked at as a means of undermining decisions. But I think sometimes it's worth doubting to think about whether, is this the right course of action? Are we making the right decisions? And doubt is a really important element, actually, in terms of managing and mitigating risks. And finally, on this point, I think that privileging relationships and trusts requires perpetual attention and support at every level. And I think one of the critical things there is is that it's not just about looking up to what's happening in terms of those who are kind of handing down orders, instructions, direction of travel. And it's not just about looking out to the partners that you're actively working with, but it's also about understanding that network of relationships and understanding how perspectives are altered by the different contexts in which we work. And I think that change, again, I come back to that change in the central local relationship, which could well be fundamental in how every individual bit of this new system working starts to operate. Okay, and so on to my final slide, if we could move on, please. So what can we take from all of this? I've just mentioned this return to command and control and this sense of centralization of power, I think will not necessarily foster good collaboration in the medium or longer term. We might force a few things through to fit with what's laid down for systems, but it doesn't necessarily get us where we need to be to form the firm foundations for the future. I think we need to think really carefully about how we establish partnerships of equals to achieve shared objectives. If in the NHS we think that the power has to sit solely with the NHS, then it's not going to lead to effective working relationships with local authorities or the voluntary sector or the independent sector if we really need to work together to get things done. I've mentioned risk a lot, but there are significant opportunities in this agenda to seize alongside the risks that we have to manage. And I think that in our conversations over the next few days, I think that that will really come to the fore because so much has already been done in terms of system working. And then in terms of our take on where we're at the moment, I think that without trust in terms of forging ahead with collaboration and integration, systems will not work, and system leadership can't work without trust. Without it, it becomes entirely dysfunctional because there's too much second guessing. We need to really get trust on the table as one of the core and first elements. So my final points are really that what we need now, so we always like people to have takeaways from what we're talking about, and I think what we need now is actually what we've always needed. We need that openness and candor that's long talked about. So sharing full information and disclosing all relevant information, being really open and upfront. We need to embrace diversity and we need to embrace doubt. We need to acknowledge and act to respect difference, dissent, and doubt. Plural voices are important. They give you a better, more rounded picture. They give you a fuller perspective. And I think that the enabling framework that we are pushing for in the legislation is one way of achieving that. Respect is critical. Fostering and maintaining mutual respect, whether it's at place level, whether it's at system level, regional level, or national level, is fundamental. And I think if there's one point to land, it is that context is absolutely everything, and culture is absolutely everything, and challenge is absolutely everything. Because without those three elements, it's very, very hard to reach the right decisions. And in terms of context, we can't change the context, the national context in which we're operating, but we can use that context to best advantage and we can challenge it. And one of the points I would make, which I think we should be worrying about and we should be seeking to push as hard as we can, is that where is the role of the non-executive in this new landscape? And that's one of the bits that I think is really important to explore and challenge. So this week's programme has got lots in it that pulls on lots of these themes. We've got risk and governance today. There's a real focus on safety tomorrow. On Thursday, there's a kind of potpourri of issues across inequalities, accountability, listening. And then on Friday, a focus on staff wellbeing and psychological safety. So really big elements there. So thank you very much. And I'm really happy to take questions.
Great, Saffron, thank you. Very typical, if I may say so, ride round the course and covering just about every base you could have done. And I think that's really helpful as a keynote. We've got an opportunity for people now to ask questions. While I'm waiting for questions, Saffron, I just wondered, how do you think we get a single version of the truth? Because one of the big problems about the whole governance agenda or decision-making agenda in a system context with multiple participants is that you spend all your time arguing about the facts rather than arguing about what you do about the facts. You got a view on that?
Yes, a single version of the truth. This comes up all the time, doesn't it? Because I think that first thing I would say, without getting too philosophical, is there ever a single version of the truth? I think it's what can most people agree on to be a single version of truth. And I think that comes, for me, it is about working out what we want to achieve and deliver, and then making sure that whatever the framework that is put around decision making and whatever the framework that's put around accountability, fundamentally it's the relationship between local partners, and that's where you get to your version of the truth. So we talk continuously about system working being founded on relationships, but it truly is, because when you get in a room together or on a Zoom together, depending on how you're doing things, it's about how you can make agreements with your other partners to do what you need to do. And that's why an enabling framework is really important, because legislation cannot provide for the multiplicity of different decisions that need to be taken in different places across the country. So for me, really effective relationships within a framework that supports them to do what they need to do is fundamental. And I think that you can't prescribe, you can't set out a kind of a prescribed set of rules and regulations around this. It has to be focused on outcomes and how you achieve that within the legalities that exist.
Thanks, Saffron. Got a question from Natasha Judge, who says her primary concern is understanding of the NHS by patients. If there are any concerns that the flexibility for what NHS bodies will look like will simply create an even more complicated system for patients to navigate.
I think that is a valid concern, and I think that one of the things we've got to make sure with these new proposals is that what's the ultimate aim is to deliver both a seamless service for patients and their families and their carers, which means that navigating their way through that system should be easier for them rather than more difficult. But we all know that the complexities of the bureaucracy of the NHS, clashing perhaps with the bureaucracies of local government as well, could lead to it becoming more difficult. And I think that's where I would say that it's really important that we get place level working at the forefront of our mind and working really effectively, because that's where communities sit and patients sit within communities. And I think navigating through from a place level is going to be incredibly important, because it's not at that system level that we will see the patient interface. It's at place level where services are delivered, where people are working in partnerships, so voluntary sector organisations working with councils and local NHS. And I think that is absolutely critical. In some ways, one would hope that in essence, this would be a good thing if patients didn't even know that these changes were being made, and the only thing that they saw was improvement to their services rather than even more difficulty navigating their way around. But it comes back to that point of where is patient voice in this new system? And I think it's something that hasn't quite been bottomed out in the way that it might be.
Okay, thanks. A question from Caroline Warner, who's at NED at Surrey and Sussex, who says, can you say a little bit more about how we start to formalise risk management system? She's particularly interested in how we think about new ways of measuring safety and quality factors.
Yeah, that's that's a big exam question. I think in terms of measuring risk, I think that it comes again to, I think, how system partners are going to come together around the table at that ICS board level, ICS body level, because it's about how do you achieve the outcomes and then establish the risks that are coming up. And I think that I would pair that with what's going to happen with the regulatory and oversight systems that are developing now to match system working. I don't have an answer really on how system level risk management should work yet, and I think it is to be teased out alongside that regulatory and oversight piece. But I think at the point of individual trusts will know that they still carry risk at the point of delivery of services and in the planning of services, and they need to focus on that alongside taking into account broader elements that are going to come into play with their system partners. But I think it is about working back from those outcomes that they're trying to achieve and the risks that come with that. But we know that governance between organisations, you don't have to work through a joint venture or something like that. Governance between organisations is immensely complex, and there is a job of work to streamline some of that. But I think trusts focusing on the risks that they face in terms of their delivery, and then widening that out to think about how that will play with their partners in the system and the different risks that they bring to bear. But yes, it's a complex issue.
Okay, thanks, Saffron. There's a question that I suspect a number of people have in their minds, and indeed you sort of hinted at it at various points during your presentation, which is basically what happens when our duty to collaborate clashes with our duty to our patients and staff. And this is particularly where for an ICS to be financially balanced, a trust is asked to reduce costs at the expense of its patients, or perhaps to deliver in a way that they don't believe is optimal. How would you deal with that very difficult balance?
It's really, I think this is one of the brass tacks issues, isn't it? I mean, when you're kind of working through what this means, actually that managing that clash is fundamental. And I think that one of the things that we've been thinking through, and we haven't come to a position yet on this, but we have been thinking through, is there a kind of arbitration mediation process that we may need to put in place to help with system decision making that does bring two elements into conflict with each other, because this is a set of relationships and all relationships have conflict, and ultimately if you can't resolve that conflict within the bounds of the system working, then it needs recourse to a third party. So it feels like an element adding in a further element of complexity, but I also think that it may well be the route that we may need to think about. But I think it's also worth remembering that the ICSs won't sit in isolation. There is the regional structure, which is an umbrella over them. So I think that there are other routes of influence and resolution that will also exist. But it's also about how to get the fundamentals of that voice round the table so that everyone is clear on what needs to be done and needs to be achieved. And of course, this situation isn't new, is it? People are put at, financial constraints exist already, which do potentially undermine patient care or undermine staff well-being. And there aren't necessarily formal routes to redress, but there are ways of making that known. And I think that we have to remember that this isn't a new situation; it's just happening in a different context.
Yeah. There's a sort of similar set of questions which people are asking. I'll try to put them together. Really, it's about the roles of NEDs in the system, and how. I mean, the the difficulty of the trust board and the system arrangements, governance arrangements, really getting too stretched, and conflict coming out of that, and a sort of view as to where does an NED's loyalties ultimately lie? Is it with the system and the interests of the patient and population health across the system, or is it with their organisation? And that's probably particularly challenging in a foundation trust without dramatic change in legislation, as we thought might have occurred.
I mean, I think this is. I think we both, with the current arrangements, we are in a situation where NEDs, I think, are in a challenging position because, you know, their legal duties are to the organisation that they are part of, and I think it's that difference. It's making that clear distinction between where their legal duties lie and where they can use their influence as well. And I think we can often look at that perspective and say that those two are mutually exclusive, but they aren't necessarily. I think it is possible to carry out your legal duties, but also to influence more widely in a way that may feel at odds, but is establishing the right path in a broader context. But the thing that I think is potentially being lost in the current arrangements is that really important challenge role that NEDs play, that really informed, intelligent questioning of decisions and strategic direction that I don't think we are seeing in quite the right way in terms of how the ICS body might be established. And I think that's where it's a conundrum for NEDs in terms of their legal duties and their influencing role. But I think what we will lose is the NED perspective, which is absolutely critical. We know how important it is to trusts and foundation trusts, and the system needs that.
Yeah, we haven't mentioned, of course, provider collaboratives and that sort of thing, which is an additional complication in it. Just one final question, and I know that there are still other questions that we'll have to answer afterwards. So be reassured, colleagues, they will be answered. This is about ambulance trusts and how they fit in, and it does seem to me that it's important that this is a dilemma, isn't it? I mean, ambulance trusts are so big, they cover so many ICSs. How are you going to get real NED scrutiny that's meaningful in that sort of context, and how do you avoid it being undermined at an organisational level?
So I think for ambulance trusts, this is if we look back at that kind of timeline of integration and collaboration, there are always a number of starting points for what, you know, what's the impetus. And I think sometimes it's worth thinking about who was in mind when these proposals were pulled together. And I would say that ambulance trusts haven't necessarily, you know, their structure and their, you know, the span and reach of what they do hasn't been fully thought through in terms of ICSs and how they can play in. I actually think that ambulance trusts, given their regional focus, have a massively important strategic role to play. And I think the challenge for us as providers as a whole, and the challenge for the system and the challenge for NHSEI and for government, is to work out how we actually make the most of that, and how we make sure that strategic perspective alongside that important service contribution is incorporated without ambulance trust being stretched so far that it's impossible. Because, you know, an ambulance trust is going to, you know, be working across at least 4 or 5 ICSs on their patch, alongside a whole host of different provider collaboratives and a gazillion places as well. So it's way too complicated and complex to be managed by a single trust with that span. And it's a gap, I think.
Okay, thanks, Saffron. We're going to have to leave it there. There's a number of other questions, but we will, I promise, we'll pick them up and we'll answer them. But thank you again for a fantastic keynote address. Really, a number of people have commented. It's really covered the field extremely well and set us up for what I think should be 4 very good days of challenge and debate around this important area of governance and quality. So thank you, and colleagues can join us now for the showcase session, South London and Maudsley, in about 5 minutes time. So thank you again, Saffron, and we'll see you soon. Right, cheers.
Bye.
Bye.